Good evening. Good evening, visionary women. My name is Shelley Reed. I'm president of Visionary Women, and on behalf of our board of directors, we are delighted to extend a very warm welcome to our leadership circle members, our visionary circle members, and our very special guests in the audience. We are delighted to see your smiling, beautiful faces. For those of you who are not familiar with Visionary Women, we are a unique nonprofit community. We are focused on providing opportunities, information, and conversation with world leaders and thinkers on issues specific to women. And we use our influence and we use our funding to support high-impact opportunities for girls and women. Since our inception, I'm happy to report just 3 years ago, we have raised in excess of $1.5 million. And we disperse those funds to a broad spectrum of initiatives that support women and girls locally, nationally, and internationally. And what we have created is a community. We actually have created a movement. And I want everyone here to recognize that and remember it, because we're, each of us, totally committed to providing opportunities and empowerment for other women. And my reminder to you is that your voices are being heard, and as a community together, we are collectively making an impact. And you will see that from all of the variety of opportunities that we're providing for so many other women and girls. So please, please, we're so proud of you. Be proud of yourselves and help us grow this powerful, impactful community. Now, before we begin our program, I would like to thank Red Car Winery, who so generously donated the wine for us tonight. Thank you very much. And we'd like to extend a warm thank you to Nicole Johnson and Planet Events, who Nicole is a Visionary Circle member and donates her time and works tirelessly to make sure our events are seamless. Thank you so much, Nicole. And of course, we want to extend a very sincere thank you to Jeffrey Deitch for hosting us here this afternoon in this incredible gallery and providing us the opportunity to see this incredible work before anyone else. So Jeffrey, I know you're here. I don't know where you are, but thank you very, very much. And last but not least, we'd like to extend our sincere appreciation to today's sponsor, Geary's of Beverly Hills. Geary's has supported us. This is the third time they have been with us from the beginning. And Tom Blumenthal wasn't able to be here this afternoon, but we just want everyone to know how very thankful we are to Geary's and for being such a strong, loyal partner to Visionary Women. Now, we have an incredible lineup of programming for you scheduled through the end of 2019. But what we have this evening is a superlative, outrageous, fabulous program. We are going to have the opportunity to meet and hear from two powerhouse female social activists, Judy Chicago and Andrea Bowers. And I can't say enough about what these women represent in terms of what they have done for the feminist movement, for women in art, for equality in gender since the 1970s. And these ladies were out there when this issue was not popular, this issue was not being discussed.
Andrea was just bored with. Sorry.
And there were a lot of challenges. And both of these ladies stood up and spoke out. So thank you very much for being here. Our moderator this evening is the wonderful Connie Butler, who many of you may remember moderated another event for us at the Marciano Museum. Connie has had the most distinguished of careers in the art and museum world. She started out at MoCA, then she went to MoMA. She was responsible for the 2007 WAC show on feminism, which was the most incredible show. And she is now the chief curator at the Hammer Museum. So it is my pleasure to introduce and start the program with Connie Butler.
Thank you, Shelley, and I want to say thank you to Angela Nazarian and to all of you visionary women. It's a wonderful organization, and also thanks to Jeffrey Deitch, wherever he is. It's really thrilling to be able to be here and see the exhibition almost first, I think. So I am not going to go into great detail about these ladies because I think a lot of sort of biography and resume and experience and so on is going to come out as we talk, but I'm really very proud, actually, to call both of them my friends and colleagues, I would say. We have all known each other a rather long time, but definitely since the 90s, and that's kind of where we're going to start, in fact, is with our respective experiences here in Los Angeles. But before I say that, I just want to say I am also going to claim them for the Hammer Museum because we're honoring Judy Chicago at our gala this year, which is extremely exciting. So I hope you all come. If you don't already have tickets. And Andrea, we're really thrilled. We're going to host her survey exhibition, which is being organized by the MCA Chicago in about 2 years. So that's just new news. So I'm thrilled about all of that. Judy set the agenda, no big surprise, for this evening's conversation, and wanted to start, I think rightly, with kind of a retrospective look at each of our experiences of the LA art world. And I was thinking that, remembering that I think when I first met you, Judy, was when I was researching the WAC exhibition, and we met in your hotel room in Santa Monica, perhaps, on a visit. You were here on a visit from New Mexico, and Andrea was a working, up-and-coming artist in LA at that time. But I remember you saying to me, giving me your blessing to organize that exhibition. And I mean, first of all, look where we are today, which is very different than the conversation we were having at that time, which after you gave me your blessing, you were kind of like, yeah, I don't know, sure, go ahead. I don't know if this is going to work. I look forward to seeing what you do. And with that blessing, and you were my queen of feminist art at the moment, and I needed your blessing to do that show. Anyway, I was just recalling that moment. So think back to your own history here in LA, and you know, begin where you like. I don't know if you want to begin in the Cal Arts years and talk about that, which you share that history or share a history with Andrea in that way, but maybe reflect back on that, starting in those years.
When were you born? No, okay.
After you.
65. After me, right?
65.
Right.
After you,
me,
yeah.
Right.
Well, no, right, you were born right around just right before me, right?
Yeah, right. I was born in 1939, remember? I'm 80.
I'm teasing you.
I just started.
Yeah, like, let's take a pause.
I was interested in talking about what our respective experiences were coming into the LA art scene. Because, you know, one of the questions I get asked all the time is, oh, have things changed? You know, so Connie wanted me to start, but actually I realized when I was coming over in the car that I really wanted to know, because I don't know what it was like for you when you entered the LA art scene in the 90s, right, which was almost 30 years after I did. So why don't you start about that? Because it addresses the issue about change right off the bat.
I mean,
So at Cal Arts, I mean, one of the reasons I went there was because of this famous, well, they accepted me. It had this famous feminist art program, you know, and people like Suzanne Lacey, who's here tonight, was one of the first. Judy started the feminist art program, and it was the first feminist art program in the United States. And it started in Fresno for 1 year, is that correct, you two? Year and a half, and then it moved to Cal Arts.
Yeah.
And so I had been working in New York. I was pretty young, I was like 25. And when I got there, I realized that all we studied were men. We hardly studied any women artists. And there were a lot of powerful, I had a lot of powerful like women peers that were studying with me, but I couldn't sort of find this history. And I was trying to like struggle between the history of conceptualism and the history of feminism, as Suzanne, I've talked a lot with Suzanne about this. And also there was a lot, like the discourse was very much like, I took Michael Asher critique classes and they could last for 2 or 3 days and you were not allowed to bring your emotions in the classroom. And this like, right? So like, you know, so I felt like there was still a lot of inequality within that system, and I was always saddened. And then I taught there later for 2.5 years, and that's when my students did that. Remember, there was a series of talks that brought a lot of feminist talks.
Didn't that grow out of finding the feminist art archives in the dumpster?
Well, that's the rumor.
That?
Yeah. That's the rumor, is that actually I believe it's like, I don't know if this is true, but I heard that the feminist archives were thrown out by the super shop dumpster and they were picked up and took to Otis. And I think that's what makes the collection at Otis. So it was this real, I think, patriarchal like destruction of a history, erasure of a history. And so Cal Arts had come to me recently and asked me to do something, to make something, and I said, I am happy to make something, you know, as a fundraiser, like a multiple, and they're like, how can we help you? And I was like, give me all of the names of the original women in the feminist art program. Who were the students? And they gave me a list that was women like 10 to 15 years later. It wasn't even the right time. So then I wrote you, and then we started writing Suzanne, and we've been trying to build this list. And I also asked a student who was there at the time,
Nancy Yodelman,
but Gosha, who worked for Suzanne Vielmetter, who used to work for Suzanne Vielmetter, and she photographed every page of the archive for me at Cal Arts. It's in two files is all that's left, 2 file boxes. And so I just started reaching out. You know, I care about this stuff. Like, I just want to know who they were. I worry about this history. So Judy and I have become closer, just like asking these questions and her telling me to reach out to people. And it's just sort of an email list that started. I sort of thought Sarah Thornton should write about it once I figure out like what to do with all the art, with these conversations. But it's crazy. It's like, oh yeah, well, what about so-and-so? She left halfway through. She was like dating Jim Morrison. Like, the stories are amazing. But I care about that history, and I'm just trying. And so that's how you and I started talking about this and thinking about what are the similarities in conceptualism and feminism? What are the differences? I mean, you've written about the program, and I've worked with Suzanne so closely, so I feel like I've gotten a sense of it, but I feel like so much of it has been erased or hidden, or, you know, in a way.
What about when you started showing in LA? What was that like when you first kind of made your professional debut?
I don't know. I mean, it seemed like there was still, I mean, you know, we felt so lucky to have been the generation after you all, like all the women feminist artists. And I called myself a feminist. That was like at a time when there was this post-feminist thing, when like feminism was a bad word.
Passé.
Yeah. And so, you know, it felt really unequal to me, but we were always being told that like I had in Germany, I was in a group show, and the curator told me, you know, feminism happened, it's over. You don't need to talk about these things anymore. So like, you know, we felt so much better off than you all, but at the same time, we couldn't acknowledge we were almost afraid to acknowledge our own inequities, if that makes sense, I don't know.
I also would say, as a curator and an art historian coming up at that time, and I remembered the 2 manila file boxes or files or whatever at CalArts because I was researching them.
Right?
I went through them and I was like, you're kidding me, this is all that's left. But also, we had never seen any of this work in person. And that was what was so incredible too. There was this kind of appetite for a history that actually didn't exist. That we knew, I mean, it existed in the basements of museums, but it wasn't on view. We had never seen your work, so many, you know, Suzanne's work, many of the artists of your peers. We hadn't seen any of it in person and very little of it in reproduction. So I always felt like part of the reason that I even wanted to organize that show at that time, and I started working on it in the late 1990s, was to materialize something, make a history, and make a show that you had to make it if you wanted to see it. It was the only way to see it.
I just want to make sure that everybody knows what we're talking about. Okay. Does everybody know what the feminist art programs were?
You should explain.
Yes or no?
You should explain.
Huh? Yes, you all know.
No,
they don't.
They don't.
Okay. I came up in LA in the 1960s. And it was incredibly inhospitable to women. That's why this show is so amazing to me, because it's bringing back work that was either I had to destroy because I wasn't getting anywhere with it, or had been erased from the history of Southern California art, even though I was actually very active in the LA art scene. I was like the only woman who was taken seriously. I was in a lot of major shows, like 10-part cylinder in the back was in LA County Sculpture of the 60s show, which probably had, I don't know, 3 women, maybe. But it was a big piece, and after I showed it, even though I was in that show, nothing happened. And I couldn't afford to store it, so I had to destroy it. Rainbow Picket was in the first minimalist show at the Jewish Museum in New York, in a show called Primary Structures, 42 artists, 3 women.
1966.
1966 or 66, yeah. I did that in 1965, and they're always celebrating the history of the Primary Structure show, all the time. Like in 2014, they did a show at the Jewish Museum, kind of redoing a kind of contemporary primary structure show, and the best part of the show was a reconstruction of the old Jewish Museum with the primary structure in it. It was like a little model. It was great. There was Rainbow Picket. But then now this year they're doing a 50-year anniversary thing in T Magazine about the primary structure show. Actually, I had the funniest conversation with Jeffrey because this guy, Arthur Lubo, interviewed me for the T Magazine article. He was all upset about, he wanted to find some artists who had gone to it. And like, I was like so young and not aware and kind of on the margins of the LA art scene that nobody told me that when you are in a big New York show, you're supposed to get on the airplane and go to the opening. So I told Jeffrey that story. He said, really? You know, if I knew you then and I was showing you, I would have paid your ticket and I would have gone with you. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, but then on the other hand, I said, Jeffrey, you know, if that had happened, if I had a dealer who did that, the whole trajectory of my career would be different. And then Jeffrey said, yeah, but then there wouldn't be feminist art. So I thought that was really funny. But anyway. Okay, but Rainbow Picket is a piece that I did when they did that show at the Jewish Museum in 2014. I did a talk. I was invited to do a talk, and I talked about how Rainbow Picket broke my heart, okay, over and over again. Because I was in a studio in Pasadena in the 60s with 2 other artists when the art world was completely different. We had a 5,000 square foot space for which we paid in total $75 a month, $25 a month a piece, okay? Anyway, there was a very powerful curator on the West Coast then, Walter Hopps. And he worked at the Pasadena Museum, and he used to go around to all the studios of artists working in Pasadena. I was the only woman. And when I finished Rainbow Picket, Walter came to the studio, you know the story, and he literally refused to look at it. Just, the story I'm going to tell you is going to tell you exactly what it was like in the 1960s, okay? So it broke my heart. It was because of my dealer then, Rolf Nelson, that it went to the primary structure show, but nothing happened, and I ended up having to destroy Rainbow Picket, although Ann Goldstein reconstructed it for a minimal future at LA MoCA in 2004. But anyway, years later, I saw Walter. By then, I had published Through the Flower, and I talked about it in my first book, but I didn't mention him. But he had obviously read Through the Flower because we had breakfast in Washington. He said, "I know you hated me." And I'm like, yeah. And he said, "But you have to understand what it was like in the 60s. Women in the LA art scene were either groupies or artists' wives. So what was I to make of the fact that you were making art that was stronger than the men's?" It was like I walked into a room and there was a woman pulling up her skirt. This is really the 60s. Actually, it's the 50s. Rolling down her stockings and revealing her whatevers. I just had to avert my eyes. And then he looked at me as if I'm supposed to say, "Oh, Walter, I really understand." The reason I'm telling this story is because it illustrates the fact of why I could get nowhere with so much of the work in this show. And in terms of CalArts, after a decade and a half of struggling in the LA art scene to get somewhere, and seeing women who I'd gone to graduate school with drop out, I thought, the hell with this. And I made a really radical change. I went to Fresno and I set up a program for young women. I knew what I wanted to do, but I was very superstitious. I still am. I was very superstitious when I was young. I never wanted to talk about anything before I did it, and I'm still like that in a way. Like I could never understand, like my male peers, they would have people in their studio while they were in the middle of something, and they'd say, "Oh yes, I'm working on this," and they'd explain it. And I'm like, no. It's like when I did Pasadena Lifesavers. There are 15 of them in the series, and I put them it took a year and a half, and I put them in racks until I was completely finished with them. I didn't show anybody for the whole year and a half. But anyway, so I told the head of the art department in Fresno that I wanted to try and help young women become professionalized without having to do what I had done, which is like hide my gender in my work. And he thought that was nice, but that wasn't really what I wanted to do. I went there with the intention of figuring out, like, could it be possible to make a female-centered art? Was there such a thing? Could there be a feminist art practice? And as part of that, I thought if I help young women make art from who they are as women without having to suppress their gender, maybe I could find my way back myself. And so that was the beginning of, that was the first feminist art program. And Suzanne Lacey was in it. Where are you, Suzanne?
She's right there.
Suzanne Lacey was in it. I interviewed young women to be in it. And Suzanne said to me, so I asked them, like, why do you want to be in the program? And Suzanne says, well, I'm really a psychology major, but I want to be creative. And I'm like, oh, you're kidding me, out. Like that is. So, of course, she turned out to be my best student, right? So that, okay. But anyway, so.
And she just had a retrospective at SF MoMA.
Right, I know.
Right. Amazing show. Amazing show.
So the first year, we're going to compress the first two questions between in this.
Can I ask you one question, though?
Yeah.
How did you make the deal to switch from Fresno to Cal Arts? Who was that with?
Paul Brack, right?
No, it wasn't Paul. It was Paul. He was the dean. So my students and I went off campus because I knew it was important to have a space.
This is when you were at Cal Arts?
No, this is in Fresno.
Fresno, okay.
We didn't intend to be off campus in Cal Arts. We intended to be on the campus, but it wasn't ready, which is how we happened to do Woman House, because we were meeting in living rooms. But anyway, so I did this program, this intensive program for young women in Fresno, and I mean, I was only 30, okay? So it was like when I started the program, it was kind of like it exploded, you know, because there was all this young energy from these women who had a lot to say, but didn't want, for whom, like one of my students, Nancy Yodelman, who wanted to be a sculptor, did not want to take sculpture courses at Fresno State because she would have had to make plaster blocks. And that is when I actually started understanding how art curriculum, is inherently biased against women. Because what she wanted to do was work with clothing and needle and thread. And that was complete taboo in those days. So, you know, once I gave them permission to be themselves, things just exploded. And, you know, I was young. And so, like, we invited famous New York feminist theoretician, T. Grace Atkinson, I invited to come to the studio. And so my, like, exuberant students, they're like, oh, we're gonna make these costumes. So they made these costumes, and they developed these cunt chairs, and the costume said C-U-N-T, right? So we go to the airport to pick her up, and they're wearing their costumes, and these Shriners get off the plane, and they're my students. See you, see you, see you! And I'm like, oh my God, what have I started? And I had, like, no support. You have to realize, I had, like, no support. But I had met Miriam Shapiro in San Diego. She and Paul were teaching there, and she was older than me. And she had come through abstract expressionism, which in New York, which was even less supportive of women than the LA art scene. And I just called her up cold and said, I really need someone to talk to. So then she came up to Fresno. She delivered the first talk she'd ever given on her work. Nobody had ever invited her to talk about her work.
But that was a big part of it too, not only the imagery that was part, you know, and the subject matter that was part of the curriculum, but also just helping these women think themselves into being artists in terms of how do you organize your work? How do you talk about your work?
What do you mean, how do you
Slides,
organize your work? Forget it, we weren't there. It was like, how do you not say, hello, my name is Susie. How do you stand up and introduce yourself? Right. How do you build a wall in your studio? How do you work every day on regular hours? How do you have a studio of your own? Right. Because like when Mimi and I went around LA in the 70s looking for women artists, I mean, they were behind their boyfriends' studios working in kitchens, or they were like Lucita Hurtado was working in a closet, right?
Yeah.
So Mimi came and saw what I was doing, and then she and Paul offered me a job at Cal Arts. Now, I had never planned to stay in Fresno. I mean, Fresno is like the navel of California. So I had never planned to, excuse me, I hope nobody's here from Fresno. You know, I always wanted to go back to LA, but I could not have done what I was doing in LA. So I had to have time away to think. So I was ecstatic, my God, and they were going to bring some of my students, and Mimi was helping them put together their portfolios. And I was ecstatic. The first major art school in the country is going to provide us with a budget, because, you know, we just funded everything ourselves. I mean, I and all the students paid $25 a month for the studio and for materials. And so here's Cal Arts. We're going to give you this huge space. We're bringing in an art historian to take your ragtag slide file that I had started by myself, looking for slides by women artists, and then my students helped. They were going to bring in our historian. They were going to develop the slide archive. They were going to give us a budget, oh my God, you know, and our own space. It was incredible, right? Well, of course, like everything that is too good to be true, it was too good to be true. But what happened was, when we all came down here, was that Cal Arts was not ready. They had been, the school was in this old nunnery in Burbank while Valencia was being built, the campus, and so they, there was no place for us to meet. So we were first meeting in everybody's living rooms. And then Paula Harper, the art historian, came up with this idea, why don't we do a project about the house, the home? And that turned into the first female-centered installation in history called Woman House.
Woman House.
Which has, you know, which has gone on to be, like, there are woman houses all the time. I mean, you know, like, I get, you know, people do, like, men and women in Germany do a woman house. You know, there was that show, Women House, which, by the way, I was originally not in. Did you know that? It was only because of Susan Fisher Sterling at NEMWA that they decided they might want to put me in to the show commemorating the project me and my students did.
There you go.
Anyway, so, but when we got on the campus, I hated it.
Well, it's not the best building. The windows don't open, you know?
So, but the thing is that there were huge amounts of archival material.
Yeah, I know.
Huge.
Where did they go?
And the other thing about this that was so painful to me about it was, of course, my whole career has been about overcoming the erasure of women's history, of our achievements, of our cultural production. And to have that happen to Woman House, it's like, even when Pacific Standard Time happened, I was really shocked that of all the things they recreated, nobody ever recreated Woman House. Probably the single most important, like Andrew Perchik says, Woman House was probably one of the most important installations of 20th century art, right?
And so many of the artists are still around.
Right,
Yeah.
and nobody has ever proposed recreating Woman House.
Right.
Which tells you something about the ongoing lack of interest in what women do and did. So, okay, so now you come into the 90s, and now you come into this terrain where we're living.
But you all are just like mythic, and we can't find a lot of information out about what had happened, which is crazy, right? Like, it's the same school we attended, and I can't find much out.
I have a question about the men. I mean, you mentioned now there are many, male artists thinking about feminism and making Women House and so on. But at the time, there were so many artists. I mean, I've been working with Larry Pittman, who talks about being at Cal Arts and being so influenced by the legacy of Women House and the feminist art program. And that program, what did you do with the male artists who wanted to even enter the program? Was there such
no, you must be kidding.
It wasn't that, yeah.
Not then. I didn't start thinking about whether the pedagogical methods I had developed in the 70s could also, be beneficial to men and artists of color until the 90s, when Donald and I started team teaching around the country and had men in the program, but not then, not in the 70s. The students, first of all, even me at that time could not be myself around men. It was just impossible. And if I couldn't, imagine young 19 and 20-year-old students early in their formation, they would never have been able to open up. Because, you know, it's like one of the reasons the young women, I still call them the Fresno girls, and they're like, Judy, we're all in our 60s and 70s. Oh, yeah, but you'll always be girls to me. You know, I mean, like when we would have discussions, and I'd go around the circle and ask them their opinions, and it took them a really long time to be able to formulate opinions. And I'd say, you know, why? And they said, nobody ever asked us what our opinions were. You know, they were used to being in mixed groups where they were Susie and Nancy and so-and-so's girlfriend, and the men carried on conversations, and they didn't participate. So, I mean, I had to deal with that level of, and I knew that. I knew that it had to do with what we used to call female role, but it's the construct of femininity that became the term that was preventing these young women from being able to realize their ambitions as artists, and that I would have to help them. I mean, I did that by myself in my studio.
I want to just, before we leave maybe these very early years, if you can just talk a little bit about the performance that is behind us, because this happened.
Fireworks pieces?
Yeah, the fireworks pieces, which you still continue to do, but which started at this early time.
Late 60s.
And talk about a little bit about the color in these, but also in the other works too.
Well, you know, when young women who interview me, they're always asking me, you know, like what it was like in the 60s. And, you know, when I tell them that the best compliment you could get was, you paint like a man, they're like speechless, of course, right? But everything that was any hint of my gender was unacceptable. My color, my imagery. In fact, even in Pacific Standard Time, Andrew told me that some of my male peers objected to the inclusion of one of the flesh gardens because it was too emotive, too fleshy. Right. So, I mean, even claiming my color, which took me a long time. However, I want to say that even though the 60s was really tough, I built my formal vocabulary, including my color systems. I did a lot of work on color in the 60s and exploring how color could be used to convey emotive states. And so I developed these color systems, and I was using them in my domes. What you have to realize is that in terms of this work, like there were 30 domes, there were 15 Pasadena Lifesavers, there were 6 flesh fans, there were 5 flesh guards. I mean, it was just, there were 30 fireworks pieces. But my point is that in my color systems that I used, so the domes were successive form domes that I then sprayed at different levels. So there was color at different levels. So it was kind of encased color, but it was laid out in a certain system like Pasadena Lifesavers. And when I was right at the same time I was doing the domes that I started the fireworks, and I laid out the fireworks exactly the same way I laid out the color inside. So you could say it was kind of like, you know, hindsight, you can always understand your gestures. I didn't understand it at the time, but it was obviously, here I am about to go to Fresno, it was obviously a kind of gesture of liberation, okay? Liberating my color into the air. And, you know, this is how it was. So now the great thing about the late 60s and early 70s is my friends and I would just go to Santa Barbara. I would buy colored smoke, and we would light it. Everybody would do something. Either people would light flares, or they brought food, or they took pictures. You know, it was like my early collaborations. But I mean, it's like that piece on the bridge in Fullerton it'd be impossible. But I did fireworks pieces in the National Forest. And then I did this trip up the Northwest coast where I saw later on, I thought, oh my God, I put colored smoke in every orifice going up the Northwest coast. But then once we were here, back in LA with my students, then I started doing these, because I'd gotten very interested in goddess imagery. And so then I started doing these fireworks pieces and painted bodies and matching the color of the bodies with the, and then for years and years, nobody knew anything about this work. Right. It only started getting attention after Pacific Standard Time Performance Festival allowed me to kind of pick up where I left off.
Since you teach, Andrea, and I'm sitting here thinking, like, how can we account for the fact that the audience and the art world, really, and the art market also, is ready for this work now? And it wasn't ready for it then. I mean, the 60s were one thing, but what do you think of that? I mean, I look at these, these performances which look so amazing to me and so interesting, and yet
Connie,
a decade ago,
your business. I can't figure this out at all, what the art world thinks is interesting and is not interesting. It's completely confusing. I mean, it's more about finally being historicized in some way, but there's still so many people that are not. So, and mainly women, women's prices, is particularly a lot of the feminists or artists who work more ephemerally, their works are nowhere near the prices men. It's still totally unequal. But I mean, it's exciting. I don't know. I mean,
can you hear her?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's interesting to hear Judy talk about is this pedagogy, this program she developed in the way that it seemed survivalist in so many ways. What came out of it was really life-changing for me. And I think that I've interpreted it in a different way, but it was, and then Suzanne picked it up and I worked a lot with Suzanne, but I had an epiphany. It was when I was recently at Judy's birthday party, her 80th birthday party. And it was totally, you have a museum that you've opened, and it's in support
of. No, it's not a museum. It's a small alternative art space.
That it's in support, though, of the community.
Yes, it's in support of the community, right.
At Judy's birthday, the new young mayor was there, and the first lady.
They're coming here for the opening. They're coming
here for this, and the old mayor is her hairdresser. And the local restaurant cooked all of the food for the party, and it was a very political event. It was organized. It wasn't just because the community was there. This is a project that Judy had worked really hard on, and that's also what I've learned from Suzanne. So part of bringing these women together was about inventing real strategies of collaborative practices, of shared authorship, of community building, of thinking about working with communities as a form of art, of ephemeral practices, site specificity, so much of what I think about and who I am, and also having a political voice, but also being able to have it be personal and political at the same time. So there was a lot of important, and then after the feminist art program, then there was the women's building too. Right? That was you could learn, I don't know, Nancy Buchanan's hair. You were in the women's building, right? You could have there would be caring for the kids, you were taken care of. There was, child care. You could learn how to fix a car.
That was Sheila.
But this all came out of all of there was all this video art, right? I think about video art is the first generation of video art coming out of feminism.
Yes, and early performance.
And this was all happening in this city, so much of it, right? It was happening in New York too, but this was a locus for it. And these are all the things I've been drawn to and trying to learn about. But it seems like there's a historical amnesia, which I think history is still dominated by patriarchy.
It's not amnesia, it's erasure.
Erasure, right? It's
like
erasure.
throwing the archives of the feminist art program away.
And not showing these artists and
Right.
not writing these histories.
Right. And I mean, really, it's a miracle that, this is what I say, my career is a miracle. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, like the art world tried to kill me and everything I ever did.
But not only that, it was really important when there started to be curators like Connie. Like when all the curators are men and all the collectors are men.
And it wasn't just, no, wait a second. I think it's really important, and this is going to segue right into what just happened to you. I think it's really important to acknowledge that in the 70s, we completely recast the discourse incorrectly because we made it all about gender, which means it is a lot about gender, but what it meant was we befriended a lot of women who were not our friends, and we alienated a lot of men who could be, okay? Because it was not just
But I also want to
women.
say that
Wait.
when I use the word patriarchy, I think of patriarchy
Patriarchy is a system.
politics.
It's a system.
political system,
Right.
and men or women can be in service
absolutely,
of patriarchy.
absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, women actually are the ones, women practice genital mutilation on their daughters. Women bound their daughters' feet. Women have been the enactors of patriarchal values, okay? And that's really important because
really
it
important.
helps to explain what happened to me and what happened to you when women turned on us, okay? Like when the dinner party was going to be shown at UCLA, Arm & Hammer, the Women's Studies Department announced they were going to picket the dinner party because it degraded women. And I'm like, by this time, the dinner party had traveled all around the world and been seen by 1 million people, all of whom recognized that the dinner party celebrated women and women's history. So how could all these feminist theorists in the 90s get it so completely wrong? Or how could a woman who was a victim of the patriarchal structure turn on you when you tried to bring to the heart of the art world the reality of patriarchal violence against women? You have to tell everybody what happened to you, Andrea.
I don't want to talk about it.
You talk about it. It's important and it's instructive, and it's instructive for women who want to make change to understand how women can be our own worst enemies.
I mean, I think it's so complicated right now because I made a really controversial, monumental artwork where I took I took the Me Too movement and basically made book reports about it, but I made it like monumental. It's 170 photographs that are photographic prints that are mainly texts that tell the story. They have the name of the accused, mainly, like, for instance, Epstein is on my list, Harvey Weinstein, I've only done 170. I have a list of over 400 names. I can't keep up with them fast enough. And the piece is so monumental now. The walls are freestanding, 13 feet tall, and I can't even remember, 66 or 67 feet long, and they're painted red. The prints are red. And I took photos from social media, mainly sort of like, I would just download photos of the men, kind of like creepy photos, but I also posted some large actions that women did or online protests or like large text. And there was one woman who posted photos of herself with bruises and as part of her, you know, as part of the Me Too movement. And I mean, I worked on this piece for 2.5 years. I think I was like so personally invested in it. It's so hard for me. It was so hard. So like
just in June. It was just
yeah,
a few months ago
yeah. So like she saw. It was like the hardest thing I've ever shown, because it was at Basel in Unlimited, and that's separate from the fair, and it's monumental works. And everybody in that room knew somebody on that wall, like taking power to the source and being like, look, we have to make change. And it's like this physical manifestation of patriarchy and of the Me Too movement. But she got really upset because I posted that photo. I reprinted that photo. And I did not mean to re-traumatize her, but it turned into one of those huge social media attacks. It was really painful. I apologize, but I think, you know, that there is this thing right now where, first of all, art is powerful. To take something and make it physical, like I took something that's social media, that's like ephemeral, and I made it physical, and it's a really powerful piece. It's probably the most powerful piece I'll ever make. But,
and I want to say, it took tremendous courage on Andrea's part to bring a piece like this into the heart of the Venice Biennale.
it was the
Basel, one of the big art fairs. And it gave, and this woman's attack on Andrea gave the art world a perfect excuse to avoid dealing with the content of the piece. It was like, it was like when feminist theorists attacked the dinner party, it gave the art world a perfect opportunity to say, see, the dinner party is like, bleh.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like these two works have a real similarity between different histories. I mean, I apologize to her. I just want to say I apologize to her. But what I'm realizing is there's this really big difference between like we're just dealing with social media too. And as women, or as like feminists, like it's this thing, like you tell this really personal story for the survivors. You're telling this personal story, but you're doing it on social media.
Right.
And it's like so crazy because I understand the need to control that story, but at the same time, we've never dealt with such a structure like social media before.
And also, she posted it, and that sort of puts it into the public domain.
I know, but I should have asked her permission. I think I should have asked her for
permission.
sorry
Yeah, but you know what?
permission.
Stop beating yourself up.
Yeah,
really.
I know.
I also think that
I can't believe I have to do this. Thank you, Judy. Thank you.
I also think it's interesting that both works, the dinner party and your work, come out of this feminist tradition of work that is more socially engaged, that does reach out to the community, that is based on an archive in a way.
Yeah, it was an archive.
And so,
yeah,
and both of them also land into this territory of the problem of contemporary art in the bigger world too. You know, whether it's Duchamp and like the found object in a way, which is what the dinner party was also, that image, the image of the woman's body. I mean, you were also, it also comes out of a Duchampian tradition.
It does not. I'm sorry, Connie, it does not. I saw that piece of Duchamp's in Philadelphia at the museum. I was horrified by it. It is the embodiment of the male gaze, and the dinner party challenges the male gaze, and it's about asserting female agency.
Of course, yeah. And I think one could say it also engages with that history of Duchamp in the 20th century, I think. But we can do that later. We could debate that another time.
I never related to Duchamp. I never did.
Okay. Okay.
And also, I don't like it, the fact that the piece he became so famous for is a quintessentially male object.
Right.
The urinal.
No, the urinal.
Like, how many of us have ever used one?
Right.
Really?
Desperation.
When the bathroom line is too long.
Bars and all. Sure.
Sorry. Not easily, but not usually. Right? Usually. Whoa. okay.
No, I was also trying to get us a little bit away from the kind of bad feminist women subject, which is a huge subject, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think,
Because
I want to tell you something.
I'm
It's not a subject that's very often addressed.
No, agreed. And I have a lot of strong things to say about it too, it's part of my lived experience also now. But yeah, I also feel
why
like
do you want to get away from the conversation?
because I think there are other things to talk about.
Okay, what do you want to talk about?
Can I just say one more thing? I also see a shift. Like, I think a lot about that. Like, I think there's a shift generationally in what feminist artists are thinking is okay and what you can do.
Yeah.
Like I talked to you about that Adrian Piper piece, which I just love, the where you go into the box and you see, that beating of Rodney King. It's like such a powerful work. It's such a political work, but then there's so much trauma. For the family or for maybe even the Black culture to have to see that over and over again. So our values are shifting, I think, and I feel like I'm learning and thinking about that and trying to figure all of this stuff out.
And who has the authority to tell these stories,
and who has
other's stories also.
Yeah, and that's tricky too, because I am a survivor, right, of sexual harassment or sexual violence. So sometimes I think and Suzanne totally disagrees with me on this, but I was so deeply involved in projecting myself onto these women's stories that maybe I didn't have enough subjectivity sometimes to because I was so deep into it because it was my story too.
Actually, that's very interesting because one of the things I actually had to deal with in Fresno and then ongoing with working with young women had to do with how hot a lot of their subject matter was.
Yeah.
And helping them establish aesthetic distance so they could actually work with that subject matter. I mean, God knows I've worked with lots of hot subject matter. And so, my new show that's about to open is grief-inducing subject matter, like what we're doing. I mean, I'm about to open a show in Washington called The And, a meditation on death and extinction that I worked on for 6 years. And, the part about it that has to do with personal mortality was easy compared to the part that deals with what we're doing to other creatures on this planet and the scale of it. I mean, so this thing about how do you engage people so that they will look at subject matter that is so hot and so emotion-inducing. Like, for example, there's one image that's about the finning of sharks. Okay, so for shark's fin soup in China, they fin sharks alive, and then the sharks sink to the bottom of the ocean floor because they can't swim, they can't eat, they can't hunt, and they suffocate to death. This is done to 100 million sharks a year. Okay? So how do you help people look at subject matter that is so loaded? This is actually where I actually believe this is the function of beauty in art. That beauty, and I used all my skills to make images that were so incredibly visually gorgeous that it would allow people time to think about the subject matter. Because, I mean, so I had to do a lot of that over the years with my students,
Or
too.
it just slows down the judgment. The aesthetics and the facture, the way it's made, it kind of slows down the judgment, so maybe they can change their minds.
It allows a path.
Yes.
Which, see, I think this is something, and when people say our art is political, it always makes me furious, because if you think about all this, okay, so there's a big article about Richard Serra.
I say that.
Last Sunday's New York Times, right? It's all about the tonnage, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, it is like the embodiment of the construct of masculinity. Tough, forbidding, imposing,
It kills,
powerful,
it kills people.
strong. What's that? That's what a man's supposed to be, right? So what are you telling me? That our work is political and his isn't? His is the carrier of patriarchal values. We only have 2 minutes more.
Yep.
Our timer just gave me the signal.
Do we want to call out any artists in the audience or anything?
Sure, yeah. Who do we want to call out?
There's some amazing artists in the audience.
There are. Where'd Mary
I
Weatherford
just want to say
go?
Mary Weatherford's here. Is she gone already?
Yeah.
She just snuck out.
Oh, she did? Okay.
Nancy Buchanan.
Oh, really?
Suzanne Lacey. Who else is here? I don't know. Two women who were involved in.
There's also Sarah Thornton.
Sarah Thornton,
Art writer. And Will Simmons. And there are wonderful dealers who've been incredibly supportive of women artists, Jeannie Greenberg-Roaton and Jessica Silverman.
Suzanne Vielmetter.
Suzanne Vielmetter, and Christine Kim is in the audience, an amazing feminist curator.
Thank you all for coming.
I also wanted to say thank you. I've spent the day crying today, I guess. I am so moved because to do this, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, we were given money to donate to organizations, and I just want to thank you all so much because today I received a check for $10,000 to give to, I'm giving to Annunciation House, and they are the people who are, they are one of the organizations in El Paso that is reuniting families and is caring for the families who are separated. So I am so excited to send this check to them, and thank you for this. That's very special. Thank you.
I'm giving my check to Through the Flower Art Space. There's a woman who's the director of Through the Flower Art Space that arose out of our communities. Donald and I live in a small town in New Mexico. New Mexico suffered greatly from the recession, especially the small rural towns like where we live. And our town wants to develop an arts corridor on the street where we live and where the Through the Flowers building is. And they came to us and asked us if we would anchor the art corridor, and our mayor, there was like this whole right-wing assault that actually made it to the New York Times. My God, Berlin in the New York Times. Anyhow, so our mayor gave his entire year's salary to start the fundraising, and our whole community came together and raised the money to renovate the space. And the mother-in-law of the mayor is the director of the space, and she does the tours in the space. And we have been watching what art can do because, in fact, I'm having my first retrospective in the spring at the De Young in May. And when we go to do docent training, I'm actually going to bring Lena Malcolm because she's been doing these tours and people are spending between 2 and 5 hours in the space.
Wow.
Which is a demonstration that if art has meaning to the viewers and is about subjects they care about, and they're helped to engage with that, you do not need fancy technology and digital like manipulations or yoga classes to get people to come to the museum. So thank you from the Through the Flower Art Space. Okay,
Are we doing
questions?
questions?
Right?
Yeah, are we doing questions? Okay. Good.
Could you stand up and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Liana. This was very, very moving for me. You know, I grew up in Germany and I came to the United States in 1985. I have an aunt who's an artist. She's 93 years old. Wow. And it's the first public conversation that I've heard that women are supporting women in such a beautiful way. And it's really moving to me. I'm sitting here with tears in my heart. And what moves me to ask you a question is, what are we doing about the art that's being lost in our children? The schools in America are not really supporting children to become artists, to nurture them, to have schools of life where they can be nourished. And parents are kind of falling in line with schools because the public system isn't really doing it. So as a mother and as a grandmother, I would love to know what can we do, or what's your suggestion? How can we just plant a seed? I'm an artist, but many of us aren't. Many of us who are mothers and sisters and aunts and grandmothers are not as gifted and as lucky to have all that creativity at our fingertips. So how can we give birth to it in the next generation and the generation after that?
I think it's just, the answer should start from like like a museum perspective.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can talk about one very small program that we have that I think should be a pilot program for, many museums of a certain scale, I suppose, which is that we, in some small answer to this problem, have a program where we bring school kids and we work with, I think it's 2 schools a year to bring the kids for a week-long intensive. Their entire program happens at the museum for an entire week, which is really a lot if you think about it. They suspend their classes, they come, they bring their lunch, we get the transportation money, all these things, and it's for kids in public schools where there is no longer any art program. And the letters that we get, the drawings that they make, the video responses to what they're seeing are incredible. What they can do with that week-long immersion is amazing. I mean, it's exactly what you're speaking to. And it's worth a whole year of art education in some ways, although, of course, we wish it was longer, and it's hard for the kids to take the time out of the curriculum. But if we could grow it, we could do more schools and so on. And it's become, my colleague Teresa Soto started it, and it's become a kind of model in the art education community. But it's one small thing. And it's hard because I think museums in many ways are asked now to fill a lot of these gaps. And we can do a lot, and it's really interesting now to think also with artists about how to, through the museum, do public engagement work, do socially engaged work. But, it's a small fraction of what the need is. So.
We have to vote for, we need to vote for leaders. Yeah. We need to vote for leaders who believe in education as a human right and believe that critical creative thinking matters from the very local level all the way up to the very national level, and that's the only way it's going to change. We have to make it change.
Yeah. That's a very good question. Okay, other questions?
Hi, thank you so much.
Who are you? Who are you?
I'm about to tell you.
Boot. She's from Canada.
My name's Diane, and I grew up in a little mining town in Quebec. And I went to Toronto, I think it was 1982, and the dinner party was there. I had never seen anything like it. I bought the poster and framed it, and have had it all these years. And my brother's girlfriend was a feminist art critic. At the time, I didn't know what that meant. And there was, I couldn't imagine how you, as a woman, could conceive of this work and even think about putting all those historical women together at the dinner party. And to show you how I grew up, it was like, I didn't know you were allowed to do that. And that, your work and reading about it helped me conceptualize art. I'm a numbers person. I don't know from art, but I go to the museums all the time and I love it and it speaks to me. But there's something about what you did that as a young woman growing up allowed me to start imagining what art could do and what women artists could do. And I wonder what you have to say to sort of the young you today, that 19-year-old, 20-year-old who's thinking about art school and wondering how it all can happen and how it all come together, what the two artists are thinking about, how you would speak to that person. Thank you very much.
I don't know how you... I think it's a real challenge for young artists now. When I came up in the LA art scene, nobody ever thought they were going to make any money. And it was not about money. It was not about the market. And it's like people, when I get interviewed, people are always asking me if I'm pissed off that it took so long for the art world to turn around. I'm like, no. I had like 50 years of uninterrupted art making. That is something that young artists,
It's true.
it's inconceivable. And they get picked up, swallowed up, and spit out at an accelerating rate. And what I would tell any young artist is find your own voice. And until that happens, stay the fuck away from the art market. And that is a big task, to find one's own voice.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm more concerned. I always, you know, I had amazing teachers like Charles Gaines and Michael Asher and, you know, Millie Wilson. They would always talk about the importance of teaching. Like, no matter what happens, you always have to teach. And lately, teaching is becoming unethical for me. Because how do I allow my students to have $50,000 to $100,000 of debt when they leave?
Yeah, or 200,000.
But once the loans start accruing, you know, it can go up to 300. I mean, it's crazy, $300,000. So I don't know what to do other than to start thinking about alternative forms of education that we need to develop, or we need to, until the government decides to forgive student debt and make affordable, no interest loans. Why are we not giving low interest? Why isn't education free? I don't know. So
we live in a capitalist society.
I know, but
that.
like, I don't know. I
That's
think
not gonna
education
happen.
should be
That's
free.
a fantasy of the left.
Well, I
honest to
know,
God.
but we have community colleges. Like, what if this kind of education is in community colleges? What if it should be affordable? It's not affordable. You can't strap. I have one assistant whose debt is $360,000. Okay, how do you do this? So something's got to change. How do we do this?
But it's like some of these questions have to do with, like, how do you solve problems that are way bigger than the individual? So even that question about teaching, like, and about art in the schools. And okay, so Donald and I live in New Mexico. Actually, we were talking last night to Tony Ressler, who's involved at LACMA and trying to do like programs for children and all that stuff.
LACMA does so much work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so in New Mexico, for years, Donald and I could not understand how we could have gotten perfectly good public school education. And New Mexico public schools are not even graduating half the kids. I mean, kids can't read, they can't do math. They're just like, that, you know. So we had a state senator from our town who happened to be the head of the New Mexico, the state legislature, Senate. And his wife was a teacher. And so we used to go to their like Christmas padrone parties, because that's the political structure in New Mexico. And one time, Donald and I asked Lynn, like, what is it with these schools? I mean, we're just not getting this, okay? So she described something to us that we had never thought about, which is the kids come to school, nobody has ever read to them, nobody spends time with them, they don't even know English, a lot of them, they haven't had anything to eat, a lot of them have been abused. One parent is maybe in jail. The other parent doesn't even have a high school level diploma. And these kids come to the schools, and then teachers are expected to solve social problems that are at such a huge level in terms of the breakdown of our social structure and our social net and our responsibility to the citizens of this country. And art is one piece of that. The lack of art education is one piece of this huge societal problem. It's like when I was at Miami Basel, there was a whole like panel about, you know, I wasn't on it, but was before a panel I did, about the inequity in prices for women, and so carried over into the conversation I had. And this woman asked a question about the inequity of prices for women artists, and it was the same thing. We live in a culture, we live in a world that doesn't value what women do. One person cannot, yeah, you can try and make a difference, you can try and make change, which I've devoted my life to, but it's important to understand. It's like, you know, eating kale is not going to solve the world's problem with energy and too many, you know, people and too much cattle. And I mean, it's like, so how do you find a path where you feel like you can actually make a contribution? Right, but you can really make a contribution.
Yeah.
I mean, on any of these levels, it's, and what can art do? And what is art's role in this? And what can we do as artists? I think those are really big questions, and they're questions that are by and large avoided in the art world. It's like, how do I get a gallery? You know, put your slides together.
And yet, I mean, I totally agree with everything you're saying, Judy, and yet it has actually changed a great deal, though, right? Especially for women, maybe not especially, but for women artists. I mean, certainly the women that you teach are entering a completely different art world.
Yes, it would be insane for me to say.
Right.
It's like I keep saying this, you know, I love going on Instagram and seeing all these sites, Club Clitoris, Vagina China, women, you know, like celebrating their bodies, big red clit. I mean, like, really, it would have been inconceivable when I was young. So it would be insane to say things hadn't changed. And in some ways, things have changed.
Right.
And so that's where we started, right? Have things changed?
We did yes, things have changed. There's still farther to go, though. That's what I would like to say.
And
there's a long way to go.
In fact, it's much more granular now, and it's much more sort of subterranean, the work that we all have to do, I think.
Not me. I'm just going to keep fighting right out in the open.
Well, that too.
I'm sorry. Let's quit. I'm tired. I'm old.
All right. All right.
Thank you all very much for coming.
And especially to Judy, Andrea, and Connie. And speaking about education, we forgot to mention that we have Otis students as our guests here, fine arts students. We're very anxious to be here, so welcome. And I think you've all had a firsthand experience this evening of seeing and hearing and witnessing what real feminist social activists are about. And thank you so much for all of your hard work and for your continuing work and your continuing efforts. And we are delighted to have been able to host you here today and experience your show and introduce you to everyone. And please, please come back again very soon.
I love you, Judy.
Thank you.